Hey, everybody, welcome to the Fractured Faith podcast. Yeah, I'm your host, Joshua Hopping, and I'm glad you're here today with me on this February 1st. Well, I guess you guys are hearing this on February 2nd, but I'm recording it the night before. It is going to be a good day. It's a little cold. Hopefully, everybody is staying warm out there with the polar kind of vortex going across a good chunk of the Turtle Island, North America, United States, I guess you would say, especially on the East Coast, wherever you happen to be turning into. I am actually on the traditional lands of the Osage people and in kind of the mid part of the United States right now, the land that's now called the US. And today, I'm actually really excited. Well, maybe excited is the wrong word or whatnot, but we're going to be talking a lot about Christian pacifism and nonviolence. And I want to be able to share this because there's a lot of rhetoric happening right now, especially within the United States church about violence. And really, there's a lot of violence in our country right now. A lot of it's going on with our ICE, our Immigration and Custom Enforcement, with the protesters, with a lot of just brutality coming through, even the way that we dehumanize people of various groups and ethnicities across the spectrum. And I think we need to come back and recenter ourselves on Jesus and really what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus. Um, Now, before we do that, I do want to take a moment and I want to have this kind of a moment of silence, which is a crazy thing to do in a podcast because, you typically want to keep your audience listening and engaged. But I do feel like we need to have a moment of silence just to be able to kind of process some of what's been going on. There's been a lot of just brutality and actions and deaths, some killings, borderline probably even murder in a lot of cases, as the courts will find out. It's just been brutal. So I think we just need to take a moment. So with that, we're going to actually just kind of stop, pause, invite the creator to come into our conversations before we go anywhere. So don't, if you're listening to this on audio, keep it on there. It's not going to be too long, but I think we need to do that. So let's pause in silence for those who have experienced violence. WWII, Creator, we acknowledge the suffering, the pain that is in this world. We acknowledge the reality of violence that has touched a lot of our lives. We acknowledge the fact that you experienced violence yourself. So be with us, surround us, and sit specifically with your hand on those right now in the midst of the situation. Let them see you where you're at in that place. Amen. Thank you guys for allowing that to spin. My heart's been heavy with a lot that's been going on in Minnesota, and it's just there's a lot happening in a lot of ways. Now, for those of you who have just now joined us, this is your first time, welcome. OCO Nagata, welcome everyone. My brief induction, you know my name, Joshua Hopping. I am a former pastor, church planner. I am an author, kind of a lay theologian, I will sometimes say. I am a Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma citizen, and I do have my master's degree of theology and culture for those who are curious about the credentials. In this podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about how we have sometimes that mosaic of belief and how there's different streams within the umbrella of what's called Christianity or Jesus followers that sometimes don't get heard or they don't get mentioned. And Christian pacifism and nonviolence is definitely a stream that does not get a lot of attention these days, especially with the rise of Christian nationalism within the United States, well, and actually around the world and other in Europe and even in some parts of South America. I think Christian nationalism is going to be another topic we may kind of hit up later, but pacifism, nonviolence is today's topic because there's so much of our rhetoric so much of our language of our leaders and pastors and political leaders and even authors and people all are talking about violence and an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, so to speak. And I think we got to come back and really again go back and center ourselves on Jesus of Nazareth, or Creator sets free. If I use the First Nations version of the Bible, which I love, by the way, if you haven't actually checked out that version of the Bible, I definitely highly recommend it. It's First Nations New Testament. There are Psalms and Proverbs as well. But they haven't got the Old Testament; they're translating it, but it's a really good Bible version there for you. But we come back, we say, okay, what is it? Now, I guess a little history for myself. I grew up again in kind of the Northeast Oklahoma on the Cherokee Nation reservation. I come from a people, the Cherokees, we fought and we had wars and stuff. Now, we always had a understanding or say diplomat and talking and being able to find nonviolence ways of resolving a conflict was definitely to be praised and honored. A lot of our good chiefs, our leaders and heroes were pacifists. Well, I say pacifists wrong road for they were pure pacifists. They were diplomats, I guess you would say. They were trying to keep us out of war, specifically war with the United States for many times. And then we also had stickball. Stickball was called the little brother of war because we realized that war could be very harmful for a lot of people. So stickball was used as a game, and you have this game with sticks. You actually have some sticks probably up there on my shelf here, but you play them with a stick and you have a ball going up and kind of hitting a post. It's kind of you think about lacrosse. Lacrosse has a big, long stick. The stickball is the shorter ones. And now again, you get brutal and you get broken arms and places and get smacked around there. So it wasn't like purely like non-violence per se, but there was other ways of handling conflict is what I was trying to get to without just having going to killing or going directly out to that. But you still had this ideal, this warrior mentality when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. This warrior mentality was still there. We typically stayed away from the U.S. military. We very few of our members actually went there. A couple of us did, but most of the time we kind of stayed away from it. And in our churches, I grew up in a very kind of more charismatic Pentecostal churches coming in. And violence. We didn't advocate violence by any means, but we didn't actually say anything pacifist as well. There really was kind of the understanding that sometimes there may be a need for violence or for killing. And then over the years, I've come to really find out that I cannot hold to killing another human as something within following Jesus of Nazareth. It really I just can't find it. It's just a hard time. And I know there's other Christians out there that have a different stance of that. And I will acknowledge that fully. And I think there's a lot of Bible verses and scriptures and areas that are kind of ambiguity, I guess you say. And there's the ones that you can really kind of lean that way, especially in the Old Testament. But I tell you right now, I am not a follower of Moses. I am not a follower of the Old Testament. I am a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus of Nazareth is my center, who I will take as the focus. And that is important. That is very important hermeneutics. So how I read the Old Testament and how I read the New Testament is I use Jesus, as seen in the four Gospels, as the hermeneutic in which I see everything else. And when there is a conflict between the words and the ministry of Jesus and the rest of them, I will fall back on the red letters of Jesus. And when you look at that core thing of Jesus, you look at what he says. Jesus says, Matthew 5:39, do not resist the evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheeks, turn the others also. Matthew 5, 4, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Another Matthew 5, blessed are the peacemakers, for they're called children of God, right? And then, Matthew 28, the famous deal, put your sword back, he says. All who draw the sword will be died by the sword. So there's these very much these deals of, hey, if you live by violence and by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. But you, the followers of God, I have called you, and the people who follow me will be known by your love, and your love to your enemies, right? The love to your enemies. I want you to love and I want to bless your enemies. those who persecute you, those who come and do you harm, I want you to pray and bless them and to push on them. Now, that is insanely crazy when you think about it, because everything in us wants us to be able to say, no, that's not what we're going to do. I want to fight back. I want to push back in that area to go back, right? And yet Jesus is saying no, don't do that. Even the tax collectors or those who do not follow me, they'll if somebody does something good for them, they'll do it back for them. But rarely is it somebody that you are to bless and love those who are hurting yourself. And Jesus, of course, lived that out in his actions when he actually went to the cross, right? He actually died. He even said, I could call 10,000s and 10,000s of angels upon this place to take this, but I am going to submit myself and humble myself even to death on a cross. If I go back into Philippians a little bit. And in that, he said, you know what? That is, it's not worth it to have this war, this fight. And of course, his people, his followers were very much ready for a fight. They wanted to bring a sword. He wanted to go. They wanted to fight. They wanted to have a Messiah that was going to kick the Romans out, to be able to restore the kingdom of God and to restore that pine that happens. But Jesus says, no, we're not going to do that. Now, and that becomes the framework. Now, I am readily going to acknowledge that there is also some things in his life of Jesus which are a little bit harder to kind of go from a pure pacifism phase. And what I mean by that is if you look at the actions of Jesus, you see him actually befriending Roman centurions and Roman soldiers, which are there specifically in Israel to basically squash down the rebellion, to be a occupying force for the land, to keep the nation, the empire of Rome going. I mean, they guess were the ice of the time, so they were the occupying military force. And Jesus actually helped heal them and care for them. He basically loved them, even though they were his enemies. And he didn't say anything about their killing. I know. So some people have used that and saying, "Hey, look, they're soldiers. You just didn't say anything, therefore it's okay." That's really an argument from silence, which is actually a logical fallacy because we just don't know what he would have said in that case. What we do know him saying is he says, "Hey, bless those and love those who persecute you," which he was living out by caring for those that were persecuting and hurting him and occupying his country, right? So he's walking out and modeling to us, I think, what we should do when we're faced with an occupying force. At the same time is this whole verse I mentioned of Matthew 5, turn the other cheek, that also has a very much of a nonviolence kind of part to it, but it's not just nonviolence for nonviolence sake. It's not saying, hey, abuse me, beat me up. There is a advocacy in that deal. In other words, if you slap them on the right cheek, it's like this backhead slap to him. If those watching on YouTube, you can see my kind of hand motions here. It's like you're slapping them with the hand. If you turn the other cheek, you can actually be hit with your other open hand as equal, right? Because it actually says the right cheek or left cheek. It kind of has that component. So the ideal there is that, hey, if you're going to strike me as an equal. Don't just slap my right cheek. You're going to actually hit me in the left cheek like somebody who would equally do it if you're coming at me. So there is this sense that, again, he's not laying over. There is a kind of a pushback to it of being able to say, hey, look, we're going to resist this occupation, but we're going to resist this occupation in a nonviolence, pacifistic way rather than picking up arms like the other zealots would do. And there's other messiahs that came into the land of Israel who did pick up arms and tried to fight back. In fact, after his death, you had the Battle of 70 AD when Jerusalem is destroyed, and that's because the Jewish people rallied against and they fought against the Roman Empire, and it was the last big rebellion that they had, and they were brutally killed. And the Christian Jews, they were still Jewish because there's only about 40 years after Jesus died, about 30 AD. This is about 70 AD, so 40 years later. They were still mostly Jewish Christian followers of Jesus. And they actually fled the city of Jerusalem because they heard Jesus say, hey, when they come at you, get out of town. And so they did. And that was one of the dividing lines because the followers of Jesus refused to fight against the Roman Empire when a lot of the Jewish people did. So again, you see this kind of working out. And in fact, I'm actually going to look at some of these early church nonviolent pacifists from like the second and fourth century. Um, you have Clement of Alexandria. This is about 150 to 200 AD. He says, "He who delights in the sight of blood cannot be pure." Right? Tertullian, the Lord, in disarming Peter, disarmed every soldier. Origen, this is one a little later, 186, 84 to about 250. He says, Christians don't fight with the emperor, they fight by prayer, a special army of piety. Or when God, forbids killing, he forbids all killing whatsoever. Latania said that. And so you see this whole ideal of the early church even saying that, hey, we're not going to go into this violence. In fact, the early church would actually forbid followers from being Roman soldiers. They said, you cannot be a Christian and be a soldier at the same time. They said that is not allowed. We're not going to let that happen. Which is, of course, right now mind-boggling because in a lot of our militaries, we have chapels and we have chaplains and we have all these people and religious kind of things in there. But in the first couple hundred years of the church, they actually said that if you're going to follow Jesus, you cannot take another human life. It was not antithetical to this ideal of following Jesus. And you cannot serve in the army of Rome and follow Jesus. Now, to be fair, part of that was because the Roman soldiers had to pay tribute to the Caesar as a god, because Caesars were seen as divine beings. So there was also some idolatry in that ideal of being on the forces. So there was that element. Again, I'm trying to be fair with it, but there's also the elements of that pacifism and not wanting to be to kill another human was something we don't want to do. They say, hey, we're not going to do this, which actually go back and think about it. To Noah's time, even God says that every human life will actually the lifeblood will be demand a calling out for it, right? The first kind of big sin was, Cain and Abel, and the lifeblood cried out. So there again, this idea of spilling the blood of humanity is a dreadful thing in so many ways. So the house that there's going back again through that area, you had this ideal of nonviolence and pacifism in there. Now we got to be careful because I do know that there was other branches of the early church that was no less so, but it's pretty much a lot. Not again, you can't ever be able to say 100% because it was very much a wide movement with the area. But I would say the predominant kind of focus of the church was very much of a strong pacifist area. In fact, they were more willing to be martyrs, to be laid down and be killed, physically killed, instead of actually picking up arms and killing somebody. So, when you say, hey, well, that's not realistic, that's not something you could do it. Well, wait a minute. I mean, the church did this. The church actually literally put their lives in the hands of God and says, kill us rather than fighting back to us. And I love the Box's Book of Martyrs, or if you read Eusebius and you read about some of the martyrs, and in those deals is when they were being killed for their faith, a lot of the non-Christians would look at them and go, we want that kind of stability or faith that they did, and they became Christians at the time. People who killed somebody would then become Christians. Paul, he used to go around killing a lot of the Jesus followers, and then he switched and he became a Christian in so many ways, right? So, and this is where the famous quote of, I can't remember who said it, but they say, hey, the blood of the martyrs was the water of the church. That's where that grew out of the earth. The church grew on because of the blood of the martyrs. And there really is that sense that was there, which was that pacifism and nonviolence. Because if the Christians, the Jesus followers, could have rallied together, they could have put armies together, they could have fought, but they did not. And it really wasn't until after Constantine in 325 or 315 when he saw the vision, and then later on as he kind of went into it, and later on I think his great grandson or whatever else in like 360 when he made the national Rome Christianity the national religion of the Roman Empire, you start seeing this bridge and this blending of violence and empire worship really there take off and then start spread. And it went further and further and got to where we're at now. But again, that kind of off on a different topic. Now, if you go into like I said, so my background was in the charismatic Pentecostal world, and I think it's very, very fitting that if you look at some of the early Pentecostal different church groups, and again, a lot of them actually had nonviolence pacifist leaning to them, even in their official writings. And so a lot of this comes from Jane Byrne actually wrote a book called Pentecostal Pacifism. There's the Pentecostal Holiness Statement of War and Peace. I'll try to put some of those in the show notes here as well. But Pentecostalism, for those who are unfamiliar with that, that came in like 1906, 1904, 1906, right in that deal by William Seymour, is they spark and movement of God, big revival in Zuzu Street over in kind of LA area in California. And it really sparked this deal of how the signs and wonders and miracles and speaking in tongues are really kind of hit the United States kind of church world really, really big at that point. And a lot of these churches kind of like the Assemblies of God, the Foursquare, Church of God of Tennessee, all these kind of groups really kind of came out of that movement from that big revival happening. And some of those, like the Assemblies of God, actually in 1914, actually had in there that says that, you know what, we are going to stay for pacifism. We're not going to be that was actually getting close to World War I, but we said we're not going to go to it, right? We're going to hold against it. The Pentecostal Inval, which is kind of a weekly kind of newspaper kind of area for a lot of Pentecostalism, they would actually say in July of 1915 during the World War I, Pentecostal saints opposed to war. We're not going to fight against the war. We're going to stay back on that. And they say, hey, we're not going to do it. And so they have that place and that claim going to it. Here I'm looking forward to here's the Assembly of God statement in 1917 says, we cannot constantly participate in war, the destruction of human life, contrary to the clear teaching of the inspired word of God. So there you have it. You got it really close in there. You also got the Church of God in Christ, which was founded by C.H. Madison. He says shedding of human blood is not to be allowed. Okay, you cannot actually go for that one in places, and there's a lot of examples from that, from Charles Parham to Frank Barnum and Donald Glean, Stanley Foreman, and a lot of these guys again in that early time really was opposed to it. Then you actually come into, and actually would say is you actually have David Allen, who was in Alabama. He was a 26-year-old Pentecostal, and he was actually beaten and shot by two police officers at his home in front of his wife for refusing military service. Okay, because again, with the whole idea of a conscience draft member of saying, hey, we're not going to go fight in violence, was not something the United States really wanted. They really wanted the people to go and to fight and to go fight for them, and they were drafting everybody in these wars. And here he is, he's a David Allen, white guy, saying, no, I'm not going to do this, and he was beaten up and killed. So their people did get killed by saying to this one. Now, years later, you have World War II, and you still had in World War II, you start having a little bit of more of the conscientious objectors. I know there's a great movie about the Quaker gentleman. I can't remember the name of him right now, but he climbs through the walls and he brings back everybody. He's serving that. But even in that one, you still had AG, Assembly of God, in 1940 said military service is incompatible with the gospel. A Christian cannot fully follow, and if he engages in armed conflict. So again, he was pulling back. They were still saying, as quoted, being able to say, no, we're not going to do this, even in World War II, with all this stuff. Now, in World War II, I tell you, the Holocaust really was not, most people in the United States did not know about the Holocaust until afterwards, right? We just knew that we had a German army that was advancing through it. In fact, there was a lot of times, there are a lot of people in America who actually liked Germany and they wanted to side with German. It was not a foregone issue that was going to go there. But that's again going into different history. But the ideal is that you had Pentecostal churches refusing to go in there. And then you had the Cold War against communism. And when the Cold War has done more, I think, damage to our churches than pretty much anything else. The more I sit and listen to the Cold War coming afterwards in the 50s and 60s, all in the 80s, I think the Cold War has done more damage to our churches because they really kind of pit a lot of our economic systems. We crouch our economics in Christian language. We fight the nationalism in Christian language. Our families were Christian language. All the kind of stuff was wrapped up into it because of the Cold War in the Vietnam area. And that's where even you see in the Assembly of God, again, I'm picking on them a little bit, but they are kind of one of the biggest Pentecostal groups out there, but they start then shifting their language and saying, yeah, well, wait a minute, we can affirm war. We're more going for the government of the United States and less so from the passive. And they start moving away from that ideal. And as you go in across the 70s and 80s, then you get to now. And I would say right now, if you look at a lot of the people who are very much pro MAGA, pro military, flags in the church of the United States and military flags and stuff, a lot of them tend to be the charismatic Pentecostal churches that came out of the Azusa Street. So you had this shift from this pacifism, kind of nonviolent stance coming out of this revival of God, which William Seymour, by the way, was a black guy minister coming in there. And yet you, even after that, you start seeing the racism kicking in, and then, pacifism maybe took 60 years, but then was kind of filtered out. And then you have this very much pro-military sense coming through there. And that's where we kind of come out today, is where we have a lot of people coming and praising and saying, hey, we don't want the Jesus of the cross. We don't want the Jesus that's turned the other cheek. We want the Jesus who's going to go and kill over people. We want the Jesus who's going to do it. And they actually go and quote Revelation. Like, if you look at Revelation, when Jesus is coming into the battle of Armageddon, he's a slain lamb. He's like, hey, look, behold, this lamb is slain on the cross. It's not the Lion of Judah. This is a slain lamb. And then they say the slain lamb looks, and he's riding on the horse, and he's blood covered. He's covered in his own blood. It's his own blood. And the sword that comes out of his mouth is the word of God. This isn't a physical violence deal. This is the crucified Jesus that is blood in his own blood, who's coming to set things right. And yet, we don't want that. We want this kill everybody, hurt everybody. And in fact, we have more akin with what maybe like the book of Joshua or Judges or these areas of like, hey, we want to go and we want to kill everybody instead of actually following Jesus. And that's the thing is, it's like, I think we need to look at Jesus. If we're going to call ourselves Christians, if we're going to call ourselves Jesus followers, then we need to follow him. And when he says to love and bless our enemies, that doesn't mean kill our enemies. That doesn't mean to dehumanize our enemies. It says to love and bless our enemies, to wish goodness upon them, to seek the benefit for them. That's what we're called to do. Now, it's not easy. I totally get it's not easy. Again, I understand that. And I understand that it's a price to be paid. It is hard. And quite frankly, I don't think most people in the United States will ever actually have to make the choice of modernism in reality. But actually, I guess you say that maybe I take that back, because we're actually seeing right now, we see nonviolent protesters being tackled in the streets right now, and cold, even laying down on the ground and being shot with his arms. So I guess there may come a choice, right? And we've seen it against too. Here I am talking about. We've seen it in the civil rights era. We've seen Martin Luther King Jr., who led nonviolent protests up against it, and then yet in their nonviolence, they were beat and attacked and dogs to them because, well, quite frankly, violence begets violence, and they want to take it, and they think power rules. But if we follow the crucified Jesus, the crucified Jesus who comes in and says, I will lay down my life for you, then no man, this is how you know your brother is loved. I'm trying to kind of paraphrase here, but he's like, the lay down your life for another is like the highest calling that's coming. And when that verse is talking about, that's not talking about a soldier. Okay, I see that in soldier quotes in the military. It's like, oh, you lay down your life for another. Like, no, it's not talking about picking up arms and fighting him and killed in battle. It's talking about somebody who says, I so love you and I so care for you. I'm going to lay down my life for you in love and deals. I am going to go through and I'm not going to fight you. I'm going to go to the cross willingly because of my brothers and sisters. I am going to walk that way. I want to put myself between the fist and the guns and the blood and maybe those who are innocent behind me. I'm going to kind of stand myself between them. And so throughout church history, we have seen this element of nonviolent pacifism, even in the charismatic Pentecostal church that even I was born in. And so it does pain me whenever I see these churches flying these flags and recruiting the military and rejoicing over violence. We need pastors and ministers and people and Christians, youth followers to say no to the violence and say no to the killings and no even to the military and be able to say no. We want to be able to follow Jesus and we want to be able to love and bless those who persecute us, to be able to walk in a place, to be able to turn the other cheeks, to be the peacemakers, for they be called the children of God, to be able to go with him. So that is my key, and that is definitely a shift. And I know as soon as I post this, it's gonna get all these deals about the Old Testament things and everything else. And there's a lot of objections I can't even go to right now. But I will say I follow Jesus. I follow the example of Jesus. I follow the red letters of Jesus. And I will let that guide me in so many ways. And so I pray and hope that you also will be able to find and go, hey, you know what? I could see the through line of pacifism and through nonviolence throughout history, through the words of Jesus to the church right now. And I ask you to really ponder another choice because we have choices. We have a choice of violence and non-violence. We can celebrate violence or we can celebrate peace. And I ask you to make that choice towards peace. So, and with that, I thank you guys so much for taking your attention. Make sure that you like and follow so you can be able to get the next edition of the Fractured Faith podcast. Share it to your neighbors. Be able to do it. It definitely is a big help for me as we try to grow the audience. If you have any questions or topics you want me to cover and talk to them, and I think I might even cover like says Christian nationalism maybe here in a bit. Leave a message for me. I definitely read the ones there, and hit me up, and we'll be able to kind of go from there. So until then, goodbye and God bless. Or be saying Cherokee, Dona Daga Ai, until we meet again. So blessings.